What's cracking, guys? Your boy Daniel here from Stack Strength, and today I want to talk about boredom and emotional eating. Now, these things are deeply intertwined. I've certainly been affected by this, and I would wager that most of you have probably experienced this to some capacity or another. Now, in this video, I want to highlight some of the main reasons why it's so difficult to overcome these compulsions and urges to eat while we're bored, or why we have these desires to consume bad food or go off diet when we're stressed out, when we're feeling low, when we're feeling depressed. And beyond that, I want to actually offer some simple and effective strategies so that you guys can minimize the negative impacts of this much more effectively, and you can start doing that today. So let's dive right into it. Now, negative emotions have been shown to precede hedonic eating. Now, hedonic eating is defined as eating in the absence of a caloric deficit, so eating purely for the sake of pleasure and enjoyment. Now, this can actually be a functional coping mechanism in a variety of ways. Now, when I say functional, I don't necessarily mean productive or beneficial in the long term, but I do mean that it's functional in the moment because it can actually help you deal with some of the difficulties that you're going through right now. So for instance, if you have a very, very stressful job, if you have a big blowout with your partner, if you're really depressed or you have a panic attack, something like that's going on, that can be very overwhelming and difficult to deal with. And turning to food, specifically highly palatable, calorically dense food, can actually give us a little bit of sense of kind of alleviation, kind of a relaxation. So if we have this parasympathetic state, this sympathetic state where we're really wound up, that's that kind of fight or flight state. All of a sudden we turn to food. The food gives us this pleasure, this enjoyment, this hedonic sense. All of a sudden we shift into a parasympathetic state. It's almost like a weight was temporarily lifted off our shoulders, and we can kind of sigh like, and relax a little bit. Now, like I said, this is temporarily a fix. It might be productive in the short term, but in the long run, it's clearly not going to be a productive solution for long-term management of stress and emotions and things like that. Now, boredom actually is associated with increased energy intake. So Moynihan et al. In a 2015 paper stated that being bored effectively marks an appraised lack of meaning in the present situation and in life. So boredom eating can actually be an attempt to escape these experiences, right? So it's really important to understand that this is a subjective evaluation of meaning. So you might be the most successful person in the world, but you just feel like you could be doing more, and because you're not doing more, you're a failure, right? That is a subjective determination. That's not objective reality. So how you feel about yourself, how you feel about your life, what you're doing, your relationships, your work, your level of health, fitness, all these things, all of that can play into your subjective determination of how meaningful and fulfilling your actual life is. So it's very important because a lot of the times those things can precede a binge eating episode or just boredom eating and things like that in general. They all are related to some degree or another. Now, it's also interesting to understand that increased work engagement, defined as, in this particular paper, a positive, fulfilling state of mind, was associated with healthier dietary habits by a paper by Amano et al. In 2020. Now, this is really important because if you find your work engaging, if you find your work meaningful, fulfilling, if you're learning, if you're being productive, these things all are associated with productive and healthier eating habits. So again, we're starting to see a little bit of a pattern emerging. If you're feeling good about yourself, you have positive emotional experiences in your life, in your work, in your relationships, these things are a little bit more going to guide you a little bit more towards healthier eating habits, whereas negative associations, negative feelings about your stress, not feeling fulfilled, all these things are a little bit more associated with boredom eating, with binge eating, with things like that. So there is an association there. Now, this is also particularly important for avoidant types who may be more susceptible to emotional eating as a means of coping with stress and difficult emotional experiences. So as I mentioned earlier, a functional coping mechanism doesn't necessarily mean it's productive long-term. It just means that it's functional in nature right now to help us just kind of get through what we're going through. Now, I want to highlight that eating behavior is extremely complex. It's mediated by several things, including your biology, so your genetics, including your environment, including your food environment, your relationships, your cognition, your economic status. All of these things really, really impact your eating behavior. So it's very complex. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. It's stuff that I wanted to kind of outline to help you guys understand the situation a little bit more effectively. But now let's move on to some of the potential strategies that you can implement in order to see better results, in order to kind of manage these things a little bit more effectively. So the first piece is creating awareness. Awareness is always going to be one of the most important things we can do around these situations. So creating awareness around current triggers, around the frequency of their occurrence, around the magnitude of the effect. So again, if we have two different triggers, And, you know, one is maybe staying 30 minutes late to work, and that's a little bit more stressful, but then we have a blowout with our boyfriend or girlfriend or significant other, whatever it is. And then we just completely go off the rails and binge and eat an entire cake or whatever it might be. These are completely different responses to stress, right? In terms of where they land on the spectrum of significance. So we need to make sure we identify which triggers are the most significant, how much of an impact they actually have, what's the frequency, and then we can get a bit more of a clear picture on, hey, like, how am I responding to these different environments, these different situations, these different triggers? And then you can start creating a little bit more of a plan, but it all starts with that awareness piece. Now, next, we want to start looking at constructing our environment. Now, when I say constructing our environment, I'm talking about, you know, your work, your relationships, your intimate relationships, not just your social life, your, you know, maybe fitness, like all of these different things all play a role. So if you find that you have certain friends that just completely drain you, and every time you leave them, you're just so stressed out and you're so emotionally drained, and that's kind of a trigger of you just kind of going off diet, that might be something to consider, you know, sort of revise it. Maybe you need to have a conversation with them. Maybe you need to just kind of start creating a little bit of distance between you guys. If you're constantly having fights with your partner, again, these are things that need to be discussed. You know, you might need to sit down and have a conversation with your partner and say, hey, you know what? I notice that every time we have these big arguments, I end up going off my diet. I end up just eating because I'm really stressed out, or, you know, I'm emotional or whatever. These are conversations that you might need to have. If you find that you're really stressed out with your work, again, all of these things need to kind of be considered, because all of these things are going to play into your actual eating behavior. Now, next, we need to look at your actual food environment. So if you are someone who has a bunch of, let's say, chips and pop and chocolates and candies, or you know, what's typically classified as junk food, if that's readily available in your home, you're much more likely to actually eat it. Whereas if it's not in your home and we have a little bit more friction between you and eating these foods, so if you have to actually get up, drive to the grocery store, buy the food, come back home, and then eat it, we're creating some points of friction, is what I usually will call it. And if we have more friction points between you and bad behaviors, and we have less friction between you and good behaviors, generally speaking, what you're going to do is probably bias a little bit more towards the good behaviors, because there's less points of friction. So if you remove some of those foods and you instead replace them with maybe fruits and veggies or different things that are also very delicious, but are a little bit more in line with what your dietary goals are and what your fitness, your health, whatever goals are, I think that can be a very, very important point, because again, we're just creating more friction between you and unproductive behaviors and creating less friction between you and productive behaviors. So that's really important as well, because those foods can also just independently act as a trigger to actually eat them. So if you see them, you might just want to eat them. And that's just kind of a habituated thing, and not necessarily because you're feeling emotional, you know, prior to that. Now, another really important thing to understand is it's very, very helpful if you think about these things in terms of replacing habits versus eliminating habits. So if you find that after about 6 p.m. you start snacking, well, instead of being like, you know what, I'm not going to snack, period, and you're trying to do that, instead of eliminating a habit, research shows that it's actually much, much easier to think about replacing habits. So instead of saying, I'm not going to eat past 6 p.m. or whatever the heck it is that you might think, instead say, you know what, I'm going to eat, but I'm going to snack primarily on vegetables and fruits. Very low calories. Fruits are very sweet. They have lots of fiber. They're very satiating, super high in micronutrients. And a lot of the times what ends up happening is it's the behavior that actually gives you that reward signal, that dopamine surge, right? And it's not the actual foods that you're consuming. So even if you were eating chocolate and that kind of was that hedonic drive or that hedonic compulsion that you were sort of driven towards, even substituting that for vegetables or fruit, the action of eating itself is actually what will give you that reward sensation a lot of the times. And then that will become habituated over time if you're consistent with that behavior. Now, lastly, if you are someone who struggles with disordered eating behavior, or you suspect you might have an eating disorder, seek out help from a qualified professional. Now, even if you don't have a disorder, but you're still struggling with this and you've tried a lot of things, you can't seem to find an effective solution that works long-term, seek out a qualified professional. This could be a registered dietitian. This could be a licensed clinical psychologist, someone who specifically specializes in disordered eating behavior. But find someone who's actually qualified who can help you out, and this can make a massive difference in your own diet, your life, and in your also like just your psychological well-being. So I hope that helped you guys. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.